Thank you, and good morning to everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying their breakfast. We promise to be a good complement to that this morning, hopefully, to coffee and fruit. Kevin De Leon, thank you so much. We've known each other for a while, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you about the political importance of Latinos in the U.S., your time as the head of the Senate in California, the first Latino ever to be president of the Senate in California, which is something that we are all very proud of. And let me start right there with political representation. I think most people here know there are more than 60 million Latinos in the US, 60% of them of Mexican origin. I think that's something that's also worth reminding people. But despite that strength in those, the strength in numbers, we haven't seen that sort of political representation, corporate representation in media and entertainment that reflects those numbers. In the case of Texas, for example, Latinos are now the largest demographic in the state. They have surpassed whites as the largest group in Texas, but we are only 10% of elected officials in the state. Representation matters because when Latinos make it to office, like you did, when they have positions of power and influence, the policies they design reflect their experiences and their journey, and reflect the experiences of Latinos in the US. So how do we advance political representation? How do we have more Kevin De Leon al frente del Senado in California? And what are we missing from that?
Well, first of all, good morning to each and every one of you. Muy buenos días. And I think a lot of folks don't know this, but for those who watch CBS News, whether it's national or international, but 60 Minutes in particular, a legendary news program, that when we talk about representation, because representation does matter, whether it's in the C boardroom of our Fortune 100 corporations, whether it is in the political sphere, the academic sphere, Hollywood, entertainment, et cetera, equity firms. It's also in the newsroom as well too. And Enrique is actually the first Latino that I know of at least, and the first individual of Mexican origin, to be specific, who's ever worked for 60 Minutes. Yeah. And I think that's an amazing accomplishment. Te felicito, Enrique. That's an amazing accomplishment.
Let's hope it's not the last one.
No. We want you're a trailblazer, and I think a lot of more folks will follow you without a doubt. So we thank you for what you do for the community as a whole, for everyone, but Latinos y Mexicanos in particular. Listen, my journey to being elected official and actually becoming the president of the California State Senate was actually quite accidental, because I had never been class president. I had never been student body president, young college Democratic president. I had never been elected to anything in my entire life until I ran for the California State Assembly. And it's a full-time legislative body like Congress, unlike Texas or the vast majority of state legislative bodies, which are part-time. Ours is full-time. And it's a very productive legislative body. So I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd ever become elected official. It was the last thing that was on my mind. But one individual kind of inspired us, a group of individuals, quite accidentally. He was a former state legislator, educated at West Point, Harvard. He became eventually the Secretary of the Army under then President Bill Clinton, and he actually became the president of the University of New Mexico. He represented downtown Los Angeles and a large Latino neighborhood in East LA. But he inspired us for actually the wrong reasons, because as a Democrat at the time, there was a lot of anti-immigrant animus in California. And he co-sponsored a bill that took away driver's license from undocumented immigrants. So some of my friends got together and we said, well, how come we're not running for office, or you? Someone should run for office. It doesn't have to be me, but this is absurd. Latino, Mexican-American, Harvard, West Point, all the Ivy League bona fides, but moving policies that were contrary to the well-being of Latinos, undocumented immigrants, Mexicanos, Centroamericanos, et cetera. So long story short, a buddy of mine ran. He became the Speaker of the California State Assembly, Fabian Nunez. I ran later on. I won in an upset. I ran against the granddaughter of Cesar Chavez, a legendary labor icon with his own U.S. postal stamp. I thought I was going to lose, and I thought I was going to lose big time, you know? Yeah, yes. And I ended up winning with the immigrant vote, with Latinos who were eventually undocumented immigrants who became legal permanent residents and eventually naturalized citizens and U.S. registered voters. And you're right, because representation matters, because the decision-making that I had the honor to be a part of, I was informed by the way I grew up as the youngest child of a single immigrant mother with a third-grade education. I had the honor to have Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans elect me to be their leader of the California State Senate. And I think by any objective measurement, you know, we moved some of the most ambitious policies that have an impact, not just in the United States of America, but throughout the world. One thing I like to say is in California, we don't import values from Washington, D.C., but, you know, we export our values elsewhere, you know. And I know I have a lot of friends in Congress. They get a little upset with me when I say that, but I said, we don't export your values from D.C. because we tend to lead the rest of the nation.
And Kevin, how ironic is it that in 2020, and let me make a parenthesis there, of course, we all know that Latino voters are not a monolith.
Sure.
We're not a cohesive group. We have the Cuban vote in places like Florida, Venezuelan American vote that's also becoming very influential. You have Puerto Ricans. You have, of course, Mexican Americans. And I want to talk specifically about those voters.
Sure.
How ironic is it that after 4 years of a Trump presidency where not just Latinos, but specifically Mexicans were used as a sort of punching bag, and given the state of U.S. democracy, that it was Mexican voters in places like Arizona that saved American democracy in 2020 by coming out to vote, by defying expectations, and even voter restriction laws in states like that, like Texas, like Arizona, like Nevada. Yeah. That talks about the power of the Latino vote beyond the numbers, but really in terms of the diversity of the voter in the U.S. and the importance that has to uphold democracy at a time like this.
Without question, and not to be partisan or overly partisan, so I respect everyone, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, or decline the state, whatever political positions you may have on the political spectrum, on the right, on the left, or in the center. But Latinos and Mexican, voters, el sufragio, folks who were undocumented immigrants who became legal permanent residents, eventually naturalized citizens and registered voters, have played a huge, role in the United States of America, particularly in battleground states. Say, for example, in Arizona. At one time, Nevada was a battleground state, and it is largely, would say, Democratic because of Las Vegas and the large number of Latinos immigrants who work in the service industry, in the hotels there. They have decisively moved the state of Nevada into the ranks of Democratic seats. But to me, it's very fascinating that a woman, whether del Bajío, de Guanajuato, de Jalisco, de Michoacán, de Sinaloa, de Tijuana, Baja California, puede cruzar frontera en busca del sueño dorado, puede trabajar como camarera, limpiando casas desde la madrugada hasta el anochecer, haciendo todo lo posible para pagar techo, agua, luz, la comida para sus hijos, and can become, after becoming undocumented, becoming a legal permanent resident, a U.S. citizen, and having the power to vote for the next president of the United States of America. And I think that the next presidential elections will be very key in states like Arizona, states like Texas, which is a solid red state, even right now still. But Latinos are playing a huge margin in a lot of other states right now, and I think it's a very exciting time. It's a very difficult time for Latinos, I think, in the United States of America, because of many of the policies that have emanated from Washington, D.C., that I think could be viewed or perceived as with an anti-immigrant animus. But at the same time, I think my party deserves constructive criticism. We have 36 years without immigration reform, close to 40 years, 4 decades. And when you have control of the executive branch, the bicameral legislative branch, both the Congress as well as the U.S. Senate, this is not an issue with regards to, do you have a master's degree or PhD or JD? Do you graduate from summa cum laude from Harvard, Yale, MIT, University of Chicago, Stanford? This is about leadership. This is about how you exercise leadership when you have political capital that's before you. And the very fact that we still don't have immigration reform, has a huge impact on our economy in the United States of America.
Latinos became the second largest voting bloc in the U.S. In 2016, surpassing African Americans.
Yes.
We're around 13% of all eligible voters. So, like you say, a key voting bloc, not just in swing states like Arizona, like Florida, that's been leaning red lately, but also in states where the difference...
It's been red for a very long time.
Yeah, no, but in the past 2-3 elections, we've seen places like Pennsylvania, like the Carolinas, Virginia, where the difference between candidates is less than 2 or 3%,
yes,
and where the Latino vote represents probably that difference in candidate elections. But I think we have all lived for a while with a myth around the Latino vote that people call the sleeping giant, somehow describing Latino voters as unreliable or enthusiastic about the political process. But I think that myth, and I call it a myth, ignores the fact that a lot of these voters have been disenfranchised, just like other minorities, in places like Texas, in places like Florida.
In red states.
In red states, in particular, of course. How do we get the message across that it's not that these voters are not engaged in the political process as much as it is that the political process is not engaging with these voters? The parties are not investing in getting these voters to turn out and vote as they are with other groups. The candidates are not speaking to the specific interests. Of course, Latinos care about the economy and jobs and education and health, but there are also some identity issues. You just mentioned immigration, religion. More Latinos are describing themselves as Christians and not Catholics. Things like that we have not seen and that could get Latinos more engaged.
Yeah, that's a very good, question in commentary, because I've always believed strongly that the Latino political purchasing power is incredible. You see the Fortune 500 companies, whether it's Toyota, whether it's Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, dedicate, tens of millions of dollars because they know their market extremely well, both quantitative and qualitative research. When it comes to the politics, I think, in America, they've been sort of behind the curve. So to put this in context, for example, I represent downtown Los Angeles, the epicenter, the economic epicenter of Southern California, in large parts of East LA. And the city of Los Angeles is actually the second largest Mexican city in the entire world. The largest Mexican city in the world is where we're standing or where we're sitting right now is Mexico City. Number 3 is Los Tapatíos, is Guadalajara. Number 4 is Monterrey, Nuevo León, and number 5 is Tijuana, where I'm from, Baja California. Number 2 is the city of Los Angeles. And
it's also the city with the second largest Spanish-speaking population in the world.
But exactly, but also the second largest Mexican population in the world, and clearly the largest Salvadorian and Guatemalan populations outside of El Salvador and Guatemala. But also too, in terms of the economy, California is the 5th largest economy in the world, nuestro PIB. We're 5th largest GDP. There's only 4 economies larger than that of California. The United States of America, in the aggregate, China, Japan, Germany, then California. So to put this in context, to understand the magnitude, the United Kingdom, France under Macron, India, Vladimir Putin's Russia, Brazil, our GDP is larger than those countries. And what I say is, largely due to the Mexican immigrant who left their state of origin to cross that border, that has really lifted up the economy of the state of California. And also too, and I had a meeting with some officials from El Banco de Mexico about a month ago, the Bank of Mexico, and they had told me that remesas in the aggregate, the dollars that folks send back home, have already surpassed the national economic output of Pemex. So that gives you a context of how powerful the Mexican voter is, el connacional en el extranjero, but in particular in the United States of America, in border states, but especially in the state of California. So I would like to see more voice and representation, especially Washington, D.C., where I think there has been very little voice, to be quite honest with you. And that's why when I became the leader of the California State Senate, I sort of made a decision politically, with the support of my colleagues within the Senate, that I would help lead the way where Washington lacks the leadership, irrespective of who occupies the White House or the leadership of both houses, that we would move forward. And that's why we made California the largest economy in the world, to legally commit ourselves to 100% clean renewable energy, decarbonizing our grid, and moving clean electrons on the grid to power our businesses as well as our residences. And that was a Latino who did that. We made California the first and largest sanctuary state in the United States of America. I got sued by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, the Department of Justice. We went all the way to U.S. Supreme Court. I think a couple of years ago, we actually won with the U.S. Supreme Court, where they stated that California legally can be a sanctuary state, irrespective of federal laws in Washington, D.C. So that's about leadership, and it's, I think, to me, what informs my policy-making decisions is where I grew up. I grew up in a largely Mexican neighborhood. My mother was a housekeeper. That informed my decision-making, who I am today.
And it's an incredible story, an incredible success story, Kevin, that we're all very proud of. So I think we've established two things, right? The political power of the Latino community in the U.S. We've established how the road to the White House goes through El Barrio. And now we
I like what you just said.
and we've just established as well that we're talking about, the fifth largest consumer market and the eighth largest economy in the world when we talk about Latinos in the U.S. So for all the people who are here in the private sector, public sector, NGOs, how do they engage with Latinos in the U.S. and why should they when we talk about North America?
Yeah.
And also, when we talk about North American identity, I mean, how more norteamericano puede ser que nosotros?
Sí.
O sea, we live in this region in 2 or 3 different languages, in 2 or 3 different cultures. We look at the Cowboys on Sunday and then at America Chivas on the next week.
The Rams,
Well, Rams,
not
of
the
course.
Cowboys,
But what I'm saying is, kids in Mexico play hockey,
Yeah.
kids in Canada are playing more soccer. Like, that's also part of, when we're in the North Capital Forum of North American identity, and it goes through demographics. And Latinos in the U.S. are leading the way, it seems, right?
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I just saw, obviously, the panel earlier with the Canadian ambassador, and Canada is an amazing country with amazingly progressive laws. So I salute, our Canadian brothers and sisters here. I've had the chance to go to Montreal and a few other provinces up in Canada. The United States, North America, and Mexico, there's just no other region, in the world. As we compete with the European Union, as we compete with China, they're frankly, when it comes to the Americas, but specifically North America, between the 3 nations, there's just really no region. And with the Mexican population, the Latino immigrant population growing even more so, there quite frankly is just no community like los mexicanos, para ser bien honesto y franco. Yo hablo de título personal y quiero subrayar, enfatizar. There's no one who works harder. There's no one who sustains the economy more so. So, when you drink that Chardonnay, that Pinot Noir, that Cabernet from Napa Valley, Russian Valley River, those grapes were picked first by a Mexican woman or man. If you go to Chez Panisse, or any fancy restaurant, the French Laundry, those heirloom tomatoes that you're having right there, those were picked by a Mexican woman's hands. If you stay in the fanciest hotel that you can imagine, $25,000 presidential suite, right, whatever it is, that hotel room and those sheets, las sábanas de seda, were cleaned and changed by a Mexican woman. And that woman will have a huge role and a voice collectively when it comes to the next presidential election, especially with those battleground states. But it's so critical because, to your point, I believe in red counties and red states, there has been a sense of intentionality, a sense of purpose to try to, if you will, depress or dissuade folks from actually exercising their political strength and power. There is a correlation, obviously, with voting strength, with academic attainment, your socioeconomic status. You don't have to be told to vote. You're going to vote based on your political and economic interests. Those at the lowest economic strata have been overwhelmed, and that's why the pandemic, COVID-19, if there was one community that was disproportionately impacted more so than anybody else, it was the Mexican community in the United States of America, because they were out there on the front lines working, many multi-generations under one roof, los abuelos, los padres e hijos bajo un solo techo, the lack of affordable health care, the ability to work, or you're going to be evicted from your house, your apartment. So they're in the hustle, and that's why they were most impacted. But that's why I believe that we have to really commit resources with a sense of intentionality. One last thing I want to say about this is that we're investing tens of billions of dollars right now in infrastructure to overhaul our antiquated grid in Los Angeles. And I think it'll be an example for the world if it works out well. As we move electrons and we have to update transformers, as we electrify our transportation system and move towards more electric vehicles, we need to make sure that we move electric vehicles into the Latino neighborhoods, build out the infrastructure, and if we do, everyone can participate in the transformation of a new economy of tomorrow.
Kevin De Leon, it's always a pleasure, like I said at the beginning,
Enrique,
having a chance to talk to you, catching up and seeing you doing so well. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone. It's a long day ahead, so I hope you had your protein. Enjoy the North Capital Forum. It's an incredible opportunity to engage in conversation, to further the agenda of integration in the region, and to have a chance, I think, hopefully to learn a couple of new things about Latino voters, in this case, in the U.S. Thanks again, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Gracias a todos. Muy buenos días. Buen día.